The following feature presentation is part of the Skywalking Network.
Welcome to Star Warsologies, the podcast about science and other academic fields of study seen in Star Wars. I'm one of your co-hosts, Melissa Miller. I am a freelance science writer and contributor to Star Wars Insider magazine.
And I'm James Floyd, your other co-host. I am also a freelance writer for Star Wars Insider magazine and author of the new book, Star Wars Crossword Puzzles and Other Word Games from a Galaxy Far, Far Away. This episode, Star Warsologies, is going to chat about the Force and comparative religions. Our guest expert today is Dr. Krista Noble, a professor of Vedic studies at Maharishi International University and author of One with the Force, 18 Universal Truths in Star Wars, which came out in November 2024. Hi, Krista.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. Let's start from the beginning. Can you tell us a little bit about the Vedic tradition and what all you have studied over the course of your career?
Sure. So the Vedic tradition comes from ancient India, and it's based on texts like the Vedas, which include the Upanishads, which have actually influenced a number of prominent Western thinkers, transcendentalist authors, and quantum physicists, and so forth. But the Upanishads discuss a lot of different deep subjects like meditation and yoga and the nature of life. So they have some really deep parallels to the Star Wars films, as we'll get into in a bit. But yeah, anyway, for myself, I grew up in a family of meditators, and I discussed philosophy around the dinner table with my parents and read books on Indian philosophy with my dad when I was a kid. So that's what inspired me to get into my current field. I did my undergraduate degree in history, but by the time I finished that, I realized that my real passion was for the Eastern teachings. And this book was a chance to bring those Eastern teachings out in relation to Star Wars and just to delve more deeply into some of the universal principles that we find in the Star Wars films.
So how did you get into Star Wars? What's your Star Wars story?
Watched the original trilogy as a kid with my parents and found it fascinating, really loved it. Could really tell there were some deep spiritual themes in there. I think right about that time, the prequel trilogy had come out. So we watched the original trilogy first, then we went and saw the prequel trilogy in theaters.
I like the idea that even as a kid, you recognized the parallels there to religion and meditation, all of that. I have to say I was pretty unaware of that at the time.
It's just kind of the context I was growing up in, that because I was familiar with some of these principles, then when I'm watching the films, it's like, wow, that's definitely there. And then it was really interesting when I was writing the book because it gave me a chance to research a lot of George Lucas's comments and his original inspiration. And he was clearly very intentionally drawing on Eastern philosophical principles, but also had this very universal perspective in mind that he was trying to bring out in the films. So, what you might initially think, oh, maybe that's just an accident. It's like, no, this was very intentional on his part.
Well, let's talk about that. You did some research into how different Eastern traditions might have influenced George Lucas. So what did you find there?
A lot of interesting things. When George Lucas was working on the original Star Wars screenplay, he had a lot of discussions with Gary Kurtz, a producer. And Gary Kurtz had a background in comparative religion, in Hinduism, in Buddhism, and they had a lot of philosophical discussions which influenced the original screenplay. And George Lucas has talked about this. He'd said that the Force was especially influenced by Eastern traditions. But other contributing factors, he lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, of course, when he was composing the screenplay, and that area was very influenced by New Age teachings, which in turn were very influenced by Eastern philosophy. And he learned the transcendental meditation technique. And to learn that technique, you also have to be introduced to a lot of the Eastern principles behind it, Indian principles, specifically ancient Indian Vedic principles. So from a lot of different sources, he was getting this influence. And he talked about that, he had this universal perspective in mind when he was creating Star Wars. He said the Force was based on his attempt to distill the essence of all religions into one concept. So he was trying to look at all these different Western, Eastern, even indigenous Native American teachings, try to distill that all into a meaningful principle. It was quite interesting to delve into some of the history behind the films and to see why that was quite intentional on his part.
Yeah.
Real quick, I'll add, he uses the analogy of the blind men and the elephant, which I thought I'd go into if your fans would be interested in hearing that.
So I read your book and that was a parable I hadn't heard before, but it's so interesting.
Oh, really?
So please do.
Great. It's a super useful one. So the parable goes that a bunch of blind individuals want to know what an elephant is like. So they find one, but they can't see it, of course. So each man touches a different part of it. And one of them touches its ear and said, oh, an elephant is like a fan. It's kind of wide and flat. Another one touches the trunk and says, what are you talking about? It's kind of like a snake. It's long and narrow and it moves. And, another one touches its leg and says, no, it's more like a tree trunk. It's very strong and sturdy. And each man is correctly describing one aspect of the elephant, but they're incorrectly concluding that their description is the whole picture, the whole elephant. So this analogy has been applied to different religions and philosophies, that they're like the blind men touching different parts of the elephant, but then concluding that the part that they accurately perceive is the whole picture. And so George Lucas has referenced this analogy. His quote was, all the religions are true, they just see a different part of the elephant. So he definitely had this universal perspective in mind going into Star Wars, that he was going to want to bring out principles that can be found in religions and philosophies and cultures throughout the world, but, trying to give more of a glimpse of the whole elephant rather than focusing exclusively on one part or one tradition. So he wasn't endorsing a particular religion.
Yeah.
Maybe just pan-elephantism.
Yeah, something like that.
So a big part of Star Wars is how many creators kind of get to play in that sandbox, right? So George Lucas set up this amazing world. And then, obviously there's the Filoni-verse now. I don't know if you watch every single series and movie and all of that. There's so much out there. But, even different... was it even by Empire there was a different director, or was that Return of the Jedi? It's like pretty quickly there was other creative influences in terms of writers, in terms of directors. And so I'm curious if you've noticed it across the movies or TV shows. Oh, this person clearly understood what George Lucas was doing, with the Force, versus, oh, this person has a different kind of take on it. And that's more, kind of like this philosophy, or any patterns you've noticed.
It's a great question. I would say that the biggest thing I noticed in the films, which is the main focus of my book, which is mostly to make it accessible to a broad range of people, because not everyone's seen all the TV shows or the novels and so forth. But the main thing I noticed in the films is that actually some of the Eastern practices like meditation and yoga, actually those references become more explicit, more obvious in the prequel and sequel trilogy. So if anything, it seemed like they were even more consciously trying to embody those influences. There are scenes when the Jedi are sitting in traditional yoga poses. There are even scenes where they're like hovering, which is a special ability mentioned in certain Vedic texts that, in theory, an enlightened person could gain over long spiritual practice, the ability to hover in midair. And so, like the original trilogy, I think it alludes to the idea of meditation, but there are more explicit references to it in both the prequel and sequel trilogies.
Cool. Well, people have often compared the Force to the Taoist concept of Qi, or the Japanese concept of Ki, but you also compare it to the Vedic concept of Brahman. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I'll just say first that there's an even more direct counterpart to Ki or Chi in the Vedic tradition, which would be prana. It means life force or life energy. And that definitely has parallels to the Force too. But I talk about it mostly in my book in relation to Brahman, just because of the all-encompassing nature of the Force, of it being something that's everywhere, that permeates everything. So the clearest parallels to the concept of Brahman, they come in the sequel trilogy when Luke and Rey are having a discussion about what the Force is. And Luke says that it's the energy between all things, a tension, a balance that binds the universe together. And that concept has a lot of parallels to Brahman. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The idea of Brahman is a universal consciousness. So a universal level of awareness and intelligence that permeates everything, that's actually the essence of all things. And so from a Vedic standpoint, one can experience that true essence of all things through meditation, through going inward, through going to the most settled level of the mind, because it's at the basis of both individual minds and the physical universe. So that's it, this idea of Brahman. But, there are a lot of parallels to the Force, the omnipresence of it, of course, this all-pervading nature. Both are associated with energy, being the source of tremendous energy, and they're both beyond the physical senses, so they're not something that you can see or hear or smell or taste or touch, in the original trilogy, when Obi-Wan is teaching Luke how to use a lightsaber, he encourages him to stop relying on his eyes, put a helmet to cover his eyes, and basically to stop relying just on the senses, that he's going to need to engage subtler levels of his awareness to connect with the Force. So similar idea to that with the meditation, that you can't see Brahman, you can't smell it, but if your mind settles down past sensory input to quieter and quieter levels, to that source of all awareness, that source of all thought, then at that level one can experience Brahman directly.
Yeah, with what you're talking about, I'm sort of curious. It really makes me think in Star Wars about this concept of force sensitive characters versus non-force sensitive. And I don't think it's something I thought about as a kid. It's like obviously Luke and the Jedi can use the force, but not everybody can. But we've gotten more into it with the sequel trilogy about Finn might be force sensitive and those sorts of things. So just with what you were talking there about, are there examples in philosophies and religions like that where, maybe you're not as sensitive to it, but you're still connected to it? What role do people like that play?
Yeah, it's a great question. From a Vedic standpoint, I would say it's definitely the idea is that every person has this potential to meditate, to touch that level of reality. So the only real parallel in that regard would be just that not everybody is at that point yet. So everybody has that potential ultimately, but not everyone has evolved to be able to use it yet.
So no midichlorians.
No, not so much. A lot more focus on.
Yeah, I like that better, honestly. To me, that's much more. I like that better. I don't like knowing that, okay, I was born with 0 midichlorians, so I have no chance of being able to pull the broom towards me. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, you're fine. I agree. Certainly it seems like most people who like the original trilogy weren't too thrilled with the addition of the midichlorians. They seem to prefer a kind of simpler, more universal perspective on the Force. But yeah, just to reiterate that, someone who maybe they have a really unhealthy lifestyle and really destructive behavioral patterns and stuff, it would be harder for them at that stage of their evolution to have an experience of Brahman, a direct experience, deep experiences during meditation or during everyday life of this underlying level of reality. But they ultimately would have that potential. They could grow to that point. They're just not there yet. So that's the closest parallel I can think of to what you're talking about for a non-force sensitive person.
Right.
You kind of mentioned that, you're reaching the kind of this ultimate level of reality, and it's not necessarily the physical. How does that tie into Yoda says that luminous beings are we, not this crude matter?
Yeah, exactly. From a Vedic standpoint, the most fundamental level of us as human beings is not our body, it's our mind, it's our awareness, it's ultimately this universal level of awareness. So they'll use the analogy of an ocean. The ocean is very calm and still at its depths, and then as you go higher and higher, it gets more and more active. So individual beings would be like waves on the surface of the ocean, but it's more like just an individualized expression of that universal essence, that universal consciousness. So from that perspective, by far the most fundamental aspect of who we are is our consciousness, is our awareness. It's definitely not our physical form, which of course goes along with the idea of immortality or life after death or anything like that, which also comes up in Star Wars.
Yeah, you had another quote in the book that I have to say I really stopped and stared at a wall for 5 minutes after reading it. That was what was it? It was like, we're not humans having spiritual experiences, we're spiritual beings having human experiences or something like that. I had to take a moment. So yeah, just a really interesting perspective and one that I hadn't thought of and one that it feels like a really important distinction.
Yeah, it's just a completely different way of coming at, the whole nature of reality.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know, you kind of mentioned the idea that like the levitation earlier, that, you can do what we'd say, magical or supernatural or miraculous things. How do we see that in the Vedic traditions or in other traditions? And then, how does that compare to using the Force?
So yeah, there is an ancient text, a Vedic text called the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali. So it's actually the basis of modern day teachings on yoga. But one of the chapters is very interesting. It's called the chapter on special abilities. And it talks about things like levitation or astral projection or out-of-body travel. It talks about that sort of thing and about the theoretical possibility of cultivating those abilities through meditation, through spiritual practices. And in theory, that would occur by first contacting that fundamental level of reality, that Brahman, that pure universal consciousness. And then from that powerful level, acting. So even introducing just an intention at that level of reality is much more powerful than just our average everyday thoughts. And so you could, through meditation, through going to that deep level, you could manifest particular outcomes. That's very similar to what we see the Jedi doing. And, first they go beyond the senses, if you will, and they connect with the Force, but then they use it to achieve a particular outcome. So the Vedic traditions, especially the Yoga Sutra, it's very explicit about how this whole thing works. But certainly throughout the world, religious and philosophical traditions refer to people having supernatural abilities, even just the miracles mentioned in the Bible and stuff like that. It's a theme that comes up a lot. So that would also be a parallel to some of the Jedi's abilities.
Yeah, well, in talking about immortality previously, the idea of like force ghosts, basically, right? That your consciousness, but it's not just your consciousness, right? You can project the image of your body. And in the case of Anakin, it's the old guy, depending on which cut you're used to looking at versus, it's Hayden Christensen's. Or Luke, honestly, when in The Last Jedi, when he projects himself onto Crate, he's a younger man, right? He stopped to, get his hair dyed and stuff like that. So I don't know where I was going with that. I guess in the original trilogy, and maybe it was the idea then, I thought all Jedi, became Force ghosts when they died. And then later, when you learn more about it and more happens, it's Obi-Wan, but actually Qui-Gon is sort of the first one to figure it out. And maybe all of the Jedi before that don't have this ability. So there's not a question here. I'm sorry. Let's talk more about this because it's a really interesting concept. And I was not necessarily surprised, but I was really interested to learn how many of the philosophies that you talk about in your book have some similar aspects.
Absolutely. And I'll just mention, since you said, not just their consciousness, but also some sort of a form, I should mention that also in Vedic teachings, there is an idea of a subtle body, or a sheath is sometimes the word that's used, but some sort of less tangible form of our awareness that can travel from, in their case, it's the idea of reincarnation. So it can travel from life to life.
Okay.
So even that idea, there's some parallel there.
Did you say sheet?
Sheath, like a covering. It's
okay.
Like there are different levels of covering, kind of like a Russian doll of essence in the middle. Actually, the analogy works pretty well because at the very center, you would have emptiness. So that's kind of like this unmanifest consciousness, just this nothingness, not literally nothingness, but this unmanifest reality. And then there are different levels covering that, building up what we are, with the outer level being the tangible physical level.
So interesting.
One of the things you kind of hinted at earlier was somebody that has kind of a lot of negativity in their life wouldn't be able to necessarily connect with kind of this cosmic force. How does that kind of compare with the ideas of the light side and the dark side? Because, in Star Wars, we have the dark side, and people who use that side of the force, tap into their anger and aggression.
It's a key difference, really, between Vedic teachings and the Star Wars teachings. In most ways, they're very aligned. But from a Vedic standpoint, tapping into that level of reality, that unmanifest pure consciousness, that Brahman, that's only going to increase your evolution, increase positive trends. So it's a difference between the two.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, so I grew up in the Catholic Church, and definitely there was the idea of, manifesting is not the word that it was used in Catholicism, but it's certainly how I sort of became to think about it was, focusing on what you want and what you're looking for and, knowing you can have it or achieve it. So I hadn't really thought about it before reading your book, that is a form of sort of positivity that I hadn't really tied into religion before. It's not just being cheerful or whatever. It's believing, knowing what you want for yourself and believing that you can attain it. That I thought was really interesting. And you're right, that's not really, there's a quote or two maybe in Star Wars, but it's not nearly as prevalent, perhaps.
Although for what you just said, I do actually think there's a pretty good parallel in Star Wars, because in the scene where Yoda lifts Luke's ship out of the swamp, Luke just has this very negative mindset that it can't be done, it's too big, and Yoda keeps trying to tell him.
Right.
Yeah, Yoda keeps trying to tell him, it's not a matter of size, the Force permeates everything. Basically, that Luke is trapped in this physicalist mindset, and it's completely getting in his way. He's trying to reach him that way, but Luke's just stuck in this very pessimistic point of view. So Yoda, not only because he believes in the Force, but because he directly experiences, he knows it's there. He knows perfectly well he can lift that ship. And so there's a basis for his positivity. It's not just blind faith in that case, but it's like, no, I know perfectly well how the Force works. I know I can lift this ship out. I know you can too, if you could get past your mental hurdles here.
Right.
Interesting. So it's different because, we talk about kind of belief, like the way I interpreted it as a kid was like Luke had to believe what he could. And like you say, he had to unlearn what he had learned about the physicality of it all. But for Yoda to not just believe he could do it, but he knew he could do it because this is what he knows the Force is capable of. That's kind of different take on it that is interesting.
Yeah, I would say that from a Star Wars perspective, or from a Vedic perspective for that matter, that belief has value, but there is something deeper than that, and that's the direct connection to the Force. Like Yoda says, the Force is his ally. He's not just saying, well, I believe it's my ally. That's just the level of consciousness, the level of awareness he's operating from, that he knows it'll support him. So there's a lot of parallels to that with the idea of an enlightened person in the Vedic tradition, or frankly in Buddhism and Taoism and some other Eastern traditions.
When we're talking about, not believing, it made me think of Han Solo, right? When we first meet him, at least, is like, I've seen a lot of stuff or whatever. But obviously then in Force Awakens, it's all true, all of it, and I'm just kind of curious what importance, in Star Wars, but also in sort of real world philosophies and religions, is it important that, I don't know if he's a convert, if he becomes a believer. I don't know what quite the right terminology is here, but that seems like an important, and it's not just because he saw it with his own eyes, I don't think, right? It's because he really, really believes it. I think that's an interesting journey for Han Solo. Again, we're not very good with questions. Maybe because we're talking about philosophy. It's like everything's kind of open-ended, where I just want to be like, discuss, Thoughts?
No.
There you go. There's a question.
No, they're great discussion topics. This is a lot of fun. Yeah, to me, I would say that probably a lot of the reason that he changes his mind is because he's seen enough things. Just watching Luke's abilities during Return of the Jedi, I think that would be a major eye-opener for him. Someone who's naturally skeptical, it's like, well, that's pretty darn compelling evidence that there's something else going on here. Perhaps there are other elements to it as well, but I think not direct experience in the sense that he's contacting the Force, but at least direct observation has to have some impact there.
That kind of reminds me the Christian Bible story of Thomas, who doubts the resurrection of Jesus. And then Jesus says that blessed are those who believe without having to see the evidence, whereas, Thomas was like, I need to see the evidence first. So Han is kind of like Thomas, that is like, I got to see it before I'll accept it.
Yeah, coming at it from a slightly more Eastern angle, an analogy I like for faith in a positive sense would be that it's like a roadmap. And so the roadmap says, okay, you're going to drive down this road, and in a little ways, you'll see a mountain. And you're driving down the road, and you're like, I don't know if this roadmap is good or not. Who knows? But then you see a mountain, you're like, okay, I have a little more confidence in this roadmap. And, then with each successive landmark, the more you're getting verification for things, you're like, okay, the more I'm pretty sure I'm on the right road. I may not have proven my ultimate destination, but it gives me a fair amount of confidence that I'm on the right path. So it's not really so much a blind faith, but it's the faith to keep going in that direction when the signs continue to support that, if you will.
Right. Okay. I like that metaphor. Yeah. Well, because when I started to think about it, as non-Force sensitive people go, right, there's Han Solo, but then I was also thinking about Rogue One, right, and Chirrut Imwe, and I don't know the right equivalent for those characters in real life or whatever. They're not really like monks or anything like that, but clearly Force believers, even if not a Force sensitive character. And so I was curious, you didn't include much of that in the book, but I'm curious about, I guess, your thoughts on Rogue One and seeing such different characters' beliefs in the Force.
Yeah. What comes to mind is that in the Vedic tradition, there are 7 different states of consciousness. I don't go into this level of detail in my book just to not overwhelm people. But anyway, the lowest state other than dreaming or sleeping is just the simple waking state. And calling it the lowest state isn't really a derogatory thing. That's the state that the vast majority of people are in from a Vedic perspective. So they're not enlightened yet. And, they have some good impulses. They have some bad impulses. It's a whole mixed bag. So I would think of someone like Chirrut Imwe as being someone who's still in that state in the sense that they haven't gained enlightenment. They don't have a direct experience and ability to use the Force. But at the same time, they're fairly evolved for the waking state, very pure intentions, very honorable, very courageous. So that's how I would conceptualize them in those terms. Again, it's a little bit of this difference where Star Wars draws this kind of strong distinction between Force sensitives and non-Force sensitives, where it's more of a spectrum or a continuum in the Vedic tradition of just where are you on your evolutionary path. And someone like Chirrut Imwe, from a Vedic perspective, would over time gain those abilities. He's just not quite there yet.
Yeah.
In Star Wars, we have the Jedi prophecy of the chosen one that will bring balance to the Force. How does the concept of balance play out in the different traditions that you've noticed?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. Relating it first to the Vedic tradition, this idea of a balance between creative and destructive forces. In The Last Jedi, in this conversation between Rey and Luke, Luke asks Rey to stretch out her feelings and to share what she perceives in her surroundings. And she talks about life, but also death and decay that feeds new life. And they show an image of like an animal skeleton under the ground where the animal's died, but its body is providing nourishment for these plants that are growing on the surface. When the light and dark sides are in balance, then there can be a positive relationship between them where there's this life followed by death and decay, but feeding new life, and there's this ongoing cycle. That idea lines up very nicely with the Vedic tradition, specifically these terms, sattva and tamas. They mean the force of creation and the force of destruction. And it's the same basic idea that in order to create a new state, you have to destroy the old state first. And so as long as those two sides stay in relative balance, they can both have an evolutionary positive tendency. And you can think of different analogies for that. Like, for instance, if you have a really beaten up old building, but you want to build a beautiful mansion, you're going to have to bulldoze that old building to build a beautiful mansion. So the key is that these two sides remain in proper balance, but you do run into situations where it gets completely out of balance. So a similar thing on a human level or a societal level, that there can be these opposing forces playing out in individual lives or society. And as long as there's a degree of balance, they can both play with each other and spin the wheel of evolution and allow for the overall progression of beings. But when one of those forces becomes very, very predominant and completely overshadows the other, then you have a huge problem. And, most of the time we're talking about this in terms of the dark destructive force completely overshadowing the light and positive and harmonious force. And so that's what we see in a lot of the Star Wars movies, where the dark forces have risen up to the point where they're about to destroy all the Jedi, about to completely snuff out that side of things. And so there's this need to bring balance back to the society.
How does that then tie into Anakin or Luke or Rey, that they're the hero that brings balance? How does that kind of manifest in one person?
Yeah. Well, from a Vedic perspective, anyone could play that role in theory. I mean, anyone could have a positive evolutionary impact, I should say, not necessarily being the hero of the whole tale. Anyone could have a positive evolutionary impact. But as I talk about in my book, there is also this concept of an avatar. And that's the idea of Brahman itself taking physical form, taking human form, and coming to set things right again, coming to bring balance back to those forces so that things can continue in their normal evolutionary path. So that comes up in the Bhagavad Gita, which is an ancient Vedic text where Sri Krishna takes physical form, and there's a great battle going on because basically destructive forces have completely overshadowed creative forces, and this balance needs to be restored, very similar to Star Wars. So Sri Krishna comes and he doesn't take part in the battle himself. That's not his role, but he supports righteousness and he supports the side that symbolizes righteousness, including the hero of the tale, Arjuna. So anyway, in some ways it's different because these are, more along the lines of the incarnate deities than just Jedi. But at the same time, the Jedi have special abilities. Just this idea of an individual coming into this world with particular special abilities and having the capacity to set things back on track. There's definitely some parallels there.
Yeah, and it goes into what I was thinking, which is, the whole bringing balance. Like you said, we're usually in Star Wars, we're talking about it from the light side. But maybe because I grew up with the original trilogy. And so, yes, there were no Jedi, allegedly, scattered around, all that sort of thing. But then certainly when we get to the prequels, it sort of always threw me off that there are always two Sith, right? But there's thousands of Jedi at some point in history. And are they the ones that are a little bit sort of imbalanced, Especially because during, the Clone Wars, their role is peacekeepers. I'm putting that in some heavy quotes. They're fighting, they're generals. They're on one side versus another and being duped the whole time, it turns out. Spoilers for, 25-year-old movies. It's just one of those things that, I'm not a Sith apologist here, but, they're only being two Sith while there's thousands of Jedi. That, to me, seems out of balance a little bit. But maybe I'm thinking, like Luke, I'm thinking about things in terms of mass as opposed to, I don't know, some other concept. It's not the number of Jedi, it's the something else.
No, it's a good point. From a Vedic perspective, on an individual level, we want to embody as much of that positivity as possible. We want to gain enlightenment. We want to ultimately not only follow along the evolutionary trail, but reach that pinnacle of evolution, the enlightenment, the higher states of consciousness. But I would say on a societal level, probably the risk of having an imbalance where the light constructive forces are completely overshadowing other forces would be the risk of stagnancy. So, I wonder if you could make an argument for that having any relevance to the prequel trilogy. Because again, if you need to destroy the old state to create a new state, it's possible that, maybe some things weren't really set up quite right and things kind of got in a rut because there wasn't any challenge from the other side.
That totally makes sense, because we see that the Jedi have become stagnant and the Republic has become stagnant and complacent. And so, it's easy for the Sith to take over because they're not looking for the challenge. The Jedi and the Republic, they get corrupted from the inside. One of the other concepts you bring up is intuition. And, like Qui-Gon says, feel, don't think. And then pretty much everybody at some point says, I have a bad feeling about this. What is the importance of that sense of feeling?
Yeah, from a Vedic standpoint, it's not the same thing as emotions. They definitely draw a distinction. They talk about different levels of the mind, and some levels being much more powerful, much subtler than surface levels. And so emotion is pretty close to the surface, just raw, everyday kind of emotions. Whereas intuition is a very, very deep level of the mind. It's close to that level of pure consciousness of Brahman. It's something that a person with purity can tap into, some level of intuition, some guiding sense of, I should go this way and not that way. So something even subtler than the intellect. So it's not to say that the intellect doesn't play a role, but I think sometimes people can relate to this in big life decisions, like should I move here, or what career should I do, or should I marry this person, or something like that. And sometimes there's just some intuitive sense, even though their intellect can come up with a gazillion reasons both for and against whatever they're contemplating. Sometimes they feel some intuitive sense of, no, this is the right way to go. So again, I just want to stress that it's, from a Vedic standpoint, a very subtle level of the mind and can easily be confused with surface level emotions, so that, it's not like either Star Wars or the Vedic tradition are saying, just do whatever you want all the time. It's a much deeper idea. And, I even think the Star Wars films bring out this distinction, not explicitly, but in The Empire Strikes Back, Luke has this vision of Han and Leia in distress, and he rushes off to help them because he's all upset by it, even though Obi-Wan and Yoda are warning him, don't do that, it's a trap. They're saying this is not a good idea, you're not ready. But he's just caught up in these impassioned emotions, and he almost gets himself killed, and his friends have to rescue him. So, like, the whole thing kind of is a disaster. Versus other points in the trilogy, like when Luke senses that there's still good in his father, even though nobody else believes that or thinks that. That's, I would say, the first is more that raw emotion that sometimes is not a very good guide of our actions. Whereas the intuition, that's a much deeper thing where he's having this insight into his father's true nature that nobody else seems to have. So, in that case, even though it seems to go against the intellect, it's such a deep impulse that he knows he needs to go with it, and sure enough, he's right.
Yeah, it was something I really enjoyed in the books. The idea of intuition, that discussion, but the fact that this, I'm not going to say throwaway line because it's iconic, but it's in every script because it's in every script, right? It's like they had to keep up the tradition of somebody saying, I have a bad feeling about this. Maybe my very favorite part of Solo is him saying, I have a good feeling about this. But I like that you can tie that even into this discussion. And it's an interesting perspective too, because like James says, pretty much every character says it at some point, including droids, right? So like, we can talk about force sensitive, enlightened, whatever, quote unquote, sort of baseline, lower, I forget now what you called the like lower end of the
waking
scale.
state.
The waking state, but also droids, like where would they fall in that? So it's just a really interesting, that makes me very happy to think about it. And it is something that, like you say, I have a gut feeling about something, so I don't do it or I do it, versus someone who's, tied into a different religion or philosophy puts a lot more weight on that perhaps than me just being like, I don't think that's the right idea. I like that there's parallels there.
Yeah, definitely.
So, we talk about some of the Jedi teachings, and oftentimes, when we look at the Jedi, we see, how they kind of became stagnant and maybe their concepts were a little off. Do you think that the Jedi teachings make for a good path of wisdom?
I would say overall, yes. I think they are dealing with some very deep themes. So, as a group of people, they're still bound to get little details wrong here or there. They're not all going to be enlightened from a Vedic standpoint yet. I think they're very evolved people overall, but anyone who's short of enlightenment is going to make some mistakes sometimes. But at the same time, I do think they bring out a lot of very deep principles. I'm sure Star Wars teachings, Jedi teachings, just like Eastern teachings, can be misconstrued, and that can be very damaging. But properly understood, I think they would be a good guideline.
Yeah, I don't know if you watched The Acolyte or Ahsoka yet, but I'm interested to hear back from you when you do, because those both have, sort of quote unquote witches, who use the Force, but in very different ways, and have some not positive things to say about the Jedi that I thought were really interesting. So I was curious if, given that sort of quick description, if there's something like that in any of these other philosophies where it's like there's disagreements, or there's, sects, perhaps different ways people apply some of the same philosophies.
Definitely. There are definitely points of contention and disagreement. One would be like, do you attain enlightenment by trying to be detached, or is detachment a natural result of enlightenment? Anyway, don't need to go into all that. But the point being, there are some pretty fundamental disputes and differences of how to view things that drastically impact the end result of how you should act. So proper understanding matters quite a bit.
Yeah, no, I think it makes sense to limit the scope of your book for now to the movies, because it's a slippery slope, as we talked about. But I found those as recent additions to the canon just really sort of interesting. Well, okay, last question from me is, what is the most unexpected character, as you were going back through these, that shared a good tidbit of wisdom? Obviously Yoda and other sort of elder Jedi, are full of these quotes, but was there any character that had something, deep to say that surprised you?
Well, funnily enough, we've already talked about him, but Han Solo, I like that he also alludes to this idea of intuition, that it's not just the Jedi. So we kind of already got into this already, but on the one hand, I think from a Star Wars perspective, the Jedi are more intuitive. They're better at searching their feelings and coming up with these deep insights. But at the same time, it's not exclusive to them, and I enjoyed that people like Han Solo can just have a gut feeling of what's going to come next.
Right.
It's more in line with that more Vedic concept, again, of it being more of just a continuum or a spectrum, not a, you either have it or you don't kind of reality.
Yeah.
So what are, some of the other universal truths that you discuss in your book, and how do they connect to the different spiritual traditions on Earth?
Wow, it's a big question.
Yeah.
No, I go through 18 of them in my book. Each of these universal truths I discuss both in Star Wars terminology and then in religious/philosophical terminology. So, the first would be there is an all-pervading force, or if you want to use religious or philosophical terminology, there is an all-pervading level of reality that can be called Brahman, or the Great Spirit, that's from Native American teachings, or God, or the Tao. So this idea of this all-pervading level of reality. And then the second principle is that it's possible to tap into that level of reality through things like meditation or prayer. We certainly see the Jedi meditating, but it's possible to tap into that level of reality, to use it, to benefit from it. But then, my book goes into a lot of other general principles that we find both in the Vedic tradition and in other religious philosophical traditions. Things like death, immortality, positivity, what our true nature is, supernatural things, mind-to-mind effects, collective consciousness, just a whole range of different ideas that we see in Star Wars, in the Vedic tradition, and in many other traditions. So for those who haven't seen my book, the first half goes deeply into some of these Eastern parallels to Star Wars, specifically through the lens of the Vedic tradition. But the second half of the book then connects all these ideas to other religions and philosophies from throughout the world, both Western and Eastern, and even Native American and First Nations teachings. So some of the takeaways would be, first of all, I'm proposing in my book that part of the reason that Star Wars is so popular is because it contains universal truths, because there are these ideas in it that resonate with people on a very deep level that goes beyond superficial religious or philosophical or cultural barriers. That's part of the reason that people resonate so much with Star Wars and with the ideas of the Force and the Jedi and all that. And also just that these principles, they don't only apply in a galaxy far, far away. They're actually very applicable to everyday life. So even just the basic principles of seeking truth, seeking righteousness, and striving to reach our full potential as human beings, these are things we see the Jedi trying to achieve. And these same principles can be applied in our lives as well.
Okay, well, changing gears slightly, tell us about your favorite Star Wars character. I'm curious to know if it's any of the sort of obvious ones after this discussion.
I like Obi-Wan.
Good choice. Is there a reason? Is that since you were a kid, or is that more your sort of adult answer?
I really like what Luke symbolizes, but I find some of the other characters a little more complex, maybe a little less just kind of archetypal, if you kind of know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
So like I really like what Luke symbolizes and the growth he goes through and stuff, but I like some of the complexity and certainly the whole thing with, on the one hand, Obi-Wan's incredibly wise and powerful, and on the other hand, he had this really complicated relationship with Anakin and even with Qui-Gon, and it's just all that complexity makes him feel alive and human, even though he's, very powerful, very wise Jedi overall.
Well, if somebody was interested in going into Vedic studies, how would you recommend them going about that?
Oh, well, the university I teach at, they have some very deep programs on this knowledge, and it even incorporates people learn to meditate themselves. They learn transcendental meditation, which has a lot of science behind it and very, very wonderful technique, very life enriching. So yeah, I would encourage them to check out some of the programs at Maharishi International University, specifically the consciousness and human potential programs. They're both online and in person. So, depending on people's lifestyles, they could go about that whatever the way they want. Or for people who just want to dip their toes in the water, learning something like transcendental meditation, which does touch on a lot of these basic principles, that's also something I would suggest.
Tell us about where we can find your book and follow you online.
So you can find my book on Amazon, on Barnes & Noble, on bookshop.org. It's One with the Force, 18 Universal Truths in Star Wars by Krista Noble. But yes, you can also go to my website and you can subscribe for updates there. My website is just kristanoble.com. So that's KRISTANOBLE.com. Yeah, I'm also active on Facebook and LinkedIn and YouTube, but all those links you can find from that central webpage of kristanoble.com.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I learned a lot of cool stuff and am really excited to just keep diving in and looking for these parallels.
Oh, no, wonderful. Thank you. I really enjoyed our discussion. We got into a lot of juicy topics, and yeah, I'm glad you found it beneficial.
Yeah, no, I definitely reading your book and then talking about this, it makes sense. I think I've always understood that there was a connection to meditation and philosophy and those sorts of things, but really seeing all the examples now, it's like all I can think of. Anytime you see a Jedi, it's like, oh yeah, they do that and they do that. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
That wraps up this episode of Star Warsologies. We want to thank our guest, Dr. Krista Noble, and we want to thank all of you for listening.
If you're looking for the links to Krista's book, check out our show notes page available at skywalkingthroughneverland.com/star-warsologies. And check out our YouTube channel where we post episodes and sometimes include related visuals from Star Wars.
If you have an idea for a topic for Star Warsologies or know an expert we should interview, let us know at Star Warsologies on Instagram and Blue Sky, or at starwarsologies@gmail.com. We also have our fan group on Facebook. It is called the Star Warsologies Podcast Fan Group, so you can join today and chat with us and your fellow listeners.
And please also make sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite service, and share it with your friends.
No topic is off limits, even whether Life Day robes from the holiday special are just the Wookiee version of Snuggies. Also, don't forget, I have my book, Star Wars Crossword Puzzles and Other Word Games from a Galaxy Far, Far Away. It is out from Chronicle Books, and you can get it at your local bookstore or on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or bookshop.org.
We are part of the Skywalking Network, where you can find a variety of other great shows about Star Wars, Disney, and Marvel, including Talking Apes, the Neverland Clubhouse, and the flagship show, Skywalking Through Neverland. There's also a YouTube show called Today in Star Wars History. You can find all of that at skywalkingnetwork.com.
See you next time on Star Warsologies when we discuss dentistry in Star Wars.